This is the second of our revision podcasts, this one looking at Weimar Germany between 1923 and 1929. This is one of the questions that you might get in an exam on a Part C question. Often they'll combine it with an earlier Weimar question. And they like it because it gives you lots of possible things to compare. It's a very straightforward example of one of those areas where there's some good stuff, but there's also some underlying bad stuff. And the examiners really like it because it's going to force you to make a decision. You're actually going to have to make a judgment here. It's a period that can be seen as good on its own, but it's also a period that can be bookended. If you think about the period that went before it and the periods that come just after it, then it's going to look quite good. The question is it that good? We tend to look at it in four different areas: politics, economy, culturally, and in terms of Germany's relations with other countries. It's foreign policy. If we take the economy first of all, that's an area where there are very, very clear improvements. During this period, Gustav Stresemann is Chancellor, and Stresemann understands money. He's an international banker, he has links with other economists around the world. He knows what he's doing with money. He introduced a Rentenmark, a new currency, in 1923, which stabilised the economy. The Dawes Plan, which he negotiated with Herbert Dawes, the American banker, brought an injection of 800 million marks into Germany from America. Exactly what the German economy needed at that time. By 1928, German industry was achieving the same levels of production as it had in 1913. Now that's a remarkable improvement. Britain, France, other Allied countries that had won the war were nowhere near their 1913 levels of production by this time period. Reparations were being paid and exports were increasing. Big steel and chemical businesses were doing particularly well. Germany was developing in new industrial areas. Workers in these industries benefited from higher wages, and the Weimar government was generally quite sympathetic to trade unions and to workers. So you saw improvements in working conditions, you saw gradual improvements in pay, and generally a low number of strikes. There are some negatives to this. The boom was based almost entirely on American loans, which at some point will have to be repaid. And American investment, which was extensive. American companies like Ford and General Motors and American Wireless had all opened in Germany and opened up German plants employing German workers. But those companies are going to take their profits back to America. And if anything goes wrong with those companies, they're going to close down their German plants first. Not all workers seem to benefit from the boom either. Agriculturally, not much improved, and largely farmers were ignored by this boom. Food prices fell. Small shopkeepers struggled. There was an increase in the introduction of large department stores. Again, an American idea, and again one that sort of appealed to this new economic wealth. People have got more money in their pockets from higher wages, they've got more money to spend in shops. But that really only benefited the big cities. You see these huge department stores in Munich and Berlin and Bremen and Dresden, large cities, but out in the countryside, not much at all. Middle class wages also fell in comparison to the working class. A university lecturer in 1913 earned 10 times as much money as a miner. By 1926 he only earned twice as much. And there is a growing resentment of the middle classes towards the working class. Let's look at culture, because culturally this period, the 1920s, is a period where Germany is cool. In all areas of arts and culture, they are leading the way. The Bauhaus style of architecture rejected traditional styles to create new and exciting buildings which are being copied all over the world. This was a golden age for German cinema. Cinema had become incredibly popular amongst mass working class people. And there were three major filmmaking areas in the world: Hollywood in America, in Los Angeles, London in Britain, and Germany. The UFA film studios in Germany were producing some of the most exciting and innovative films produced anywhere in the world. Great directors like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau were developing whole new genres of cinema, science fiction and horror. As all cinema was still silent, it was possible for German stars to become massive worldwide stars. If a film's silent, it doesn't matter whether they're speaking German, English or whatever. Marlene Dietrich became the world's first really international sex symbol. Berlin had a reputation for its daring and wild nightlife. Censorship had been removed by the Weimar government, which allowed far more sexual content, far more open criticism of politicians and traditional ideas, which freed up artists to question traditional ideals and to break new ground. For homosexuals, there was a greater level of freedom. It was still illegal, but in Berlin it was openly common. Again, there are negatives to this though. That big cultural achievement, that big cultural change is largely urban. It's popular in big cities like Berlin, and it's popular with the younger generation. It doesn't have a great appeal out in the countryside, out in the far east and the south of Germany, and certainly not with older Germans. The older generation were increasingly worried and increasingly critical of the country's moral decline. You see things like the Wandervogel movement starting, who organised camping trips and allowing Germans to go back to nature and celebrate traditional values and ideas. Now these are similar to some of the values and ideas and some of the activities that the Nazi Party will gain huge popularity from promoting in the 1930s. Politically, again, there are some positives. There are no more rebellions, there are no more putschs during this period, and extreme parties like the Nazi Party, like the Communist Party, are far less common. The Nazi Party in particular almost faded away. Hitler was seen as a joke figure, as a caricature, as an example of extreme lunacy. The two main extreme parties, though, on the negative side, did still exist. They didn't collapse during this period. They were rebuilding, they became more organised, and we'll look next week at the growth of the Nazi Party and see how much they were rebuilding during this period. Worryingly as well, the number of people voting in each election fell between 1923 and 1929, and they had an awful lot of elections. No political party was ever able to command a majority in the Reichstag. So you got lots of coalitions, you got lots of changes of government, which meant that nobody could really achieve anything, nobody could really get anything done. What you see is ordinary people getting bored with politics. And when they get bored, when they stop voting, extremists gain in power, particularly in Germany when they have a system of proportional representation. The percentage of votes you get is the percentage of seats you get in the Reichstag. So you can get into the Reichstag with a very small number of votes. That could be quite a high percentage if not many people vote overall. There were 4 different chancellors between 1923 and 1929. That's too many. There are too many changes. In 1926, Friedrich Ebert, the first president of the Weimar Republic, stepped down, and the German people elected Paul Hindenburg. Hindenburg was a war hero. He was one of the leading generals. He was commander-in-chief of the German army during the First World War. And he's very right-wing. He's a personal friend of the Kaiser. Although he disliked the Nazis and personally couldn't stand Hitler, he's very right-wing in his political views. In terms of foreign policy, Stresemann successfully negotiated the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan in 1928, which both of them reduced reparations It spread them out over a longer period of time. In 1925, Stresemann signed the Treaty of Locarno, which finally ended any German disputes over their borders with France and Belgium. In 1926, Germany was allowed into the League of Nations. Under the Treaty of Versailles, they'd been specifically excluded from that. And in 1929, British, French and Belgian troops finally left the Rhineland, having occupied it for 10 years since the end of the First World War. In terms of negatives, being part of the League of Nations wasn't such a great attraction, to be honest, by 1926. Big countries like America and Russia had refused to join it altogether, and other countries were quite keen to ignore it or pull out of it. People were already beginning to doubt whether it had any real power or influence. The League of Nations needed Germany far more than Germany needed it. So there you have a mixed picture. You have some real successes, you have some real growths, but you also have some worrying underlying problems. The great what-if question of history is, well, what if there hadn't been a Wall Street crash in 1929? What if there hadn't been a Great Depression? Would Germany have continued to improve as it had done for the previous 6 years? Or are those underlying problems so severe they were always going to pull Germany down? The other way to look at it, I suppose, is you compare it with what went before and what went after. It's like, if you've got a history lesson period 2, you've got maths period 1 and geography period 3, automatically history looks fantastic. It's the best period of the day because of what happens before it and after it. Maybe that's what's going on in 1923 and 29. Compare it to what goes before with all the putschs and French invasion, it's very good. Compare it with what comes after, the Great Depression and the Nazi Party, it's really quite good. But on its own, is it really that good? Thank you very much for listening and watching. I hope you found this one useful. I hope you go off now and do lots and lots of revision. Go on, go, now, get lost. Go!